A millionaire adopts a black boy thinking he's giving him a second chance at life. For 5 years, he gives him everything: wealth, comfort, even his name. But behind closed doors, the boy is watched, judged, and treated like he doesn't belong. Then, on his 15th birthday, the millionaire gets a life-changing call, one that forces him to choose between a $200 million inheritance and the only child he's ever loved. What dark secret was hidden in the adoption papers? And what will the boy do when he finds out the truth was never love, but legacy? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun barely penetrated the thin curtains of apartment 4B, casting weak shadows across the worn linoleum floor, where 10-year-old Jamal Carter sat cross-legged with his cereal bowl. The generic cornflakes had gone slightly soggy, but he didn't mind. His attention was fixed on his mother, Renee, who stood at their small kitchen table shuffling through a stack of papers with trembling hands. "Everything's here," she muttered, more to herself than to Jamal. "They can't say it's not all here." Jamal spooned another mouthful of cereal, watching as his mother organized the documents into neat piles. Her usual grace was replaced by nervous energy that made her fingers fumble with the paper's edges. She wore her cleaning uniform, crisp blue dress with a white collar, ready for her shift at the Grayson estate later that day. "Mama?" Jamal's voice was soft. "Want me to help?" Renee looked up, her worried expression melting into a gentle smile. "No, baby. You just finish your breakfast. I've got this sorted." She straightened her back, trying to project confidence she clearly didn't feel. "These people just need to see that all our paperwork is in order, that's all." The sharp knock that came at their door made them both jump. Jamal's spoon clattered against his bowl, splashing milk onto the floor. The knock came again, 3 hard, official-sounding raps that seemed to shake the whole apartment. "Ms. Carter," a male voice called out. "Open up, city officials." Renee's face paled, but she squared her shoulders. "Coming," she called, gathering her papers. She moved to the door, her sensible work shoes clicking against the floor. "Jamal, stay right there, baby." When she opened the door, morning light flooded their dim apartment. 2 police officers stood at the front, with several men in suits behind them. One held a clipboard, another wore a contractor's logo on his shirt. "Ms. Carter, we have an eviction order," the clipboard man stated flatly, holding out a document. "You need to vacate the premises immediately." "No, there must be a mistake." Renee's voice was steady as she held up her own papers. "I have all the documentation right here. The Housing Assistance Office approved our—" "Ma'am, step aside," one of the officers cut in, already moving forward. "The order's been signed by the judge. You can take it up with the housing court later." The contractor and his crew pushed past, heading straight for the apartment's contents. Jamal scrambled to his feet as one of them approached his cereal bowl. "Don't touch that," Renee's voice rose. "You can't just— I have proof we're allowed to be here." She tried to show them her papers again, but the officer blocked her path. Jamal pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding as strange men began picking up their belongings. One grabbed the framed photo of him and his mother at the park, carelessly tossing it into a box. "Mama!" he called out, fear making his voice crack. "Get your hands off my son's things." Renee moved toward Jamal, but the officer grabbed her arm. She twisted away, her cleaning uniform wrinkled in the struggle. "Let me go." "Jamal, baby, it's going to be okay." Everything happened so fast. Renee pulled free. The officer reached for her again, and in the chaos, she was shoved toward the open door. Jamal saw her arms windmill, heard her sharp intake of breath. Then came the horrible sound, a series of thuds punctuated by a sickening crack. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. "Mama?" Jamal's whisper echoed in the sudden stillness. He ran to the doorway, but the second officer caught him before he could reach the stairs. "Mama!" She lay at the bottom of the stairwell, unnaturally still. Her blue uniform was twisted around her body, white collar askew. Papers from her housing documents floated down like dead leaves, settling around her. "She slipped," the first officer said quickly, already speaking into his radio. Request medical assistance at 1242 Riverside Apartment Complex B. Civilian down from accidental fall. Jamal struggled against the officer's grip, but the man held him firmly. "Let me go! Mama! Mama!" His voice grew hoarse from screaming as more officers arrived, their radios crackling with static and codes he didn't understand. The paramedics came next, their equipment clattering on the metal stairs. Jamal watched, numb, as they knelt beside his mother. Their movements were quick at first, then gradually slowed. Finally, one of them looked up and shook his head. A white sheet appeared. Jamal had seen enough TV to know what that meant, but his mind refused to accept it. This was his mama down there, his mama who made him toast with cinnamon sugar on Sunday mornings, who helped him with his writing homework even when she was tired from cleaning houses all day, who sang old gospel songs while folding laundry. The officer guided him down the stairs past where they were covering his mother's body. Jamal caught a final glimpse of her hand, still wearing the simple silver ring she never took off, before the sheet settled over it. Outside, red and blue lights painted the building's dirty walls. Neighbors had gathered, whispering behind their hands. A news van screeched to a halt at the curb, a reporter already jumping out with a microphone. The officer opened the back door of his patrol car. "Watch your head, son," he said, helping Jamal inside as if this were a courtesy ride, as if Jamal's whole world hadn't just shattered into pieces. Through the window, Jamal watched the scene unfold like a TV show happening to someone else. Officers strung yellow tape across the stairwell. The contractor's men continued carrying out furniture in boxes. The reporter stood in front of her cameraman, speaking seriously into her microphone. And there, on the ground floor, paramedics waited beside a covered shape that couldn't be his mama, because his mama was supposed to take him for ice cream after her shift today. She'd promised. Sirens wailed in the distance, more police maybe, or another ambulance, but they were too late. Everything was too late. The morning sun had risen fully now, harsh and bright. It hadn't even been 2 hours since Jamal sat eating his cereal, watching his mama organize papers. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the patrol car window and closed his eyes, wishing he could wake up from this nightmare. But the sirens kept wailing, and his mama's papers kept blowing across the parking lot, and the morning kept moving forward, dragging him with it into a world he didn't recognize anymore. The fluorescent lights of the group home buzzed overhead as Jamal sat cross-legged on a worn couch, his eyes fixed on the small television mounted to the wall. 2 days had passed since that morning, though time had become strange and sticky, moving both too fast and too slow. In continuing coverage of the Carter incident, a news anchor said, her voice professionally detached, questions remain about the circumstances leading to the death of Renee Carter during what officials describe as a routine eviction. The screen split to show grainy footage of paramedics wheeling a covered stretcher. Jamal's fingers dug into his knees, but he didn't look away. That shape under the white sheet was his mama. He'd watched them cover her. He'd watched them wheel her away. Housing advocates point to possible clerical errors in the eviction paperwork, another anchor chimed in, while city officials maintain proper procedures were followed. The image changed to show a man in an expensive suit standing at a podium. "This is a tragedy that raises serious questions about housing enforcement protocols," the lawyer said, adjusting his tie. "The Carter family had filed all necessary documentation to prevent eviction. We will be pursuing a full investigation." Jamal barely heard the words anymore. They all sounded the same. People talking about papers and protocols and procedures. Nobody talked about how his mama had made his lunch the night before, carefully wrapping his sandwich in wax paper because she said it kept the bread fresher than plastic bags. "Hey, sweetie," a social worker, Ms. Thompson or Wilson he couldn't remember, approached carefully. "Maybe we should watch something else." Jamal didn't respond. He hadn't spoken since that morning, not to the police, not to the paramedics, not to any of the endless parade of adults who wanted him to open up and process his trauma. Outside the group home's windows, voices grew louder. A small crowd had gathered, holding signs with his mama's name and phrases like, "Justice for Renee," and "Housing rights are human rights." Jamal watched as they chanted and marched in circles. By dinner time, they were gone. The next day brought his first foster placement. The family seemed nice enough. A couple with 2 other foster kids who gave him his own room with a blue bedspread and a desk by the window. But their house smelled wrong. Everything smelled wrong now, like his mama's lavender lotion wasn't in the world anymore. "You can put your things here," the foster mother said, opening a drawer. Jamal clutched his backpack tighter. It held everything he'd managed to grab before they'd taken him from the apartment. His mama's silver bracelet, the photo album she kept under her bed, and the journal she'd been writing in every night. That evening, when the foster father reached to pat his shoulder at dinner, Jamal flinched so hard he knocked over his water glass. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. When the foster mother tried to take his mama's bracelet to clean it up nice, he'd screamed and thrown his textbook at the wall. "I'm sorry," the foster mother told the social worker when they came to pick him up. "We're not equipped to handle this level of volatility." Back at the group home, Jamal heard them talking in the office. Words like non-responsive and shut down and needs intensive intervention filtered through the thin walls. He pressed his mama's bracelet to his chest and remembered how she'd worn it every day, the silver links catching the light as she worked. Across the city, in a sleek high-rise office with floor-to-ceiling windows, Martin Grayson sat at his desk eating a delivered lunch he couldn't taste. His television, mounted on the wall opposite his desk, played the news on mute. He watched the footage of Renee Carter's body being loaded into the ambulance, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. The caption scrolled beneath, "Community demands answers in Carter death." Martin set his fork down, his appetite gone. He'd seen this story several times over the past 2 days, but something about it needled at him, wouldn't let him look away. "Mr. Grayson?" His assistant, Sarah, appeared in the doorway. "Your 3 o'clock called to reschedule, and the board wants to know if you'll be joining the conference call at 4. Martin didn't answer. He reached for his laptop, fingers moving across the keyboard. Jamal Carter intake file. The search brought up restricted documents, but that wasn't a barrier for someone with his access. A photo appeared on his screen, a boy with serious eyes and a set jaw, staring straight into the camera as if daring it to look away first. "Sir?" Sarah stepped closer, concern creasing her forehead. "Are you all right?" Martin continued staring at the photo. Something about the boy's expression, the way he held himself even in a government intake photo, it stirred memories he'd spent years burying. He could feel Sarah hovering, waiting for a response, but he couldn't find the words. The TV continued its silent replay of the news. Renee Carter's body being wheeled away, protesters with their signs. A school photo of Jamal, probably from before, showing a hint of a smile that was nowhere to be seen in his intake photo. Martin's mouse hovered over the file. 10 years old. No living relatives. Current status. Emergency placement pending psychological evaluation. Notes from the group home staff described him as withdrawn and potentially volatile. The foster family's report mentioned aggressive responses to physical contact and attachment issues with deceased mother's possessions. The cursor blinked on his screen, waiting. Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Sir, should I reschedule the rest of your afternoon?" Martin kept reading, his eyes moving over the details of Jamal's file again and again, his expression unreadable as the city stretched out below his window, indifferent to the weight of decisions unmade. The group home's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the institutional green walls as Martin walked down the hallway. 2 weeks had passed since he'd first seen Jamal's file, and the building was exactly as he'd imagined, a place trying its best to be welcoming while working with too little funding and too many needs. A tired-looking staff member led him through the common areas, pointing out the shared dining room and the small library filled with donated books. The smell of industrial cleaner hung in the air, barely masking the underlying scent of too many people living in too small a space. "Jamal's usually in the reading corner," the staff member said, gesturing toward a worn armchair tucked into an alcove. "He doesn't interact much with the other kids. Or anyone, really." Martin nodded, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. He found Jamal exactly where they said he'd be, curled up in the corner with a dog-eared copy of what looked like a science textbook. The boy wasn't reading, though. His attention was focused on the margins, where he was carefully drawing intricate patterns with a stubby pencil. "Hello, Jamal," Martin said softly, maintaining a careful distance. "My name is Martin Grayson. Would you mind if I sat with you for a while?" Jamal didn't look up, but his pencil paused briefly before continuing its path along the page's edge. Martin took that as enough of an invitation and settled into a nearby chair. Not too close, but not so far as to seem standoffish. "That's some interesting artwork," Martin observed, his voice gentle and measured. "Do you enjoy drawing?" The pencil kept moving, creating swirls and geometric shapes that seemed to tell their own kind of story. Martin didn't push for a response. Instead, he pulled out his own notebook and began working on some correspondence, allowing a comfortable silence to settle between them. The visits continued like this for the next week. Martin would arrive, always at the same time, always with the same calm demeanor. He'd sit near Jamal, sometimes working, sometimes reading, occasionally making quiet observations about the weather or asking simple questions that required no response. On his third visit, Martin noticed Jamal had switched from drawing patterns to writing words, small, neat sentences that filled the margins like tiny rivers of thought. He couldn't make out what they said, and he didn't try to read them. Some things deserved to remain private. The fourth visit started like the others. Martin arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, nodding to the now familiar staff members as he made his way to the reading corner. Jamal was there, as always, but today he had a different book. Something about cooking, judging by the pictures of food on the cover. Martin had just settled into his usual chair when Jamal's voice, soft but clear, broke the silence. "Do you know how to cook eggs?" The question caught Martin off guard, and a genuine smile spread across his face. "I do, actually. Several different ways. Do you have a favorite?" Jamal's eyes remained on the book, but his fingers had stopped tracing the pages. "My mama made them scrambled, with cheese sometimes when we had it." Martin's heart tightened at the mention of Renee, at the way Jamal's voice both strengthened and wavered when speaking of her. "Scrambled eggs with cheese are excellent. My mother taught me to add a little milk to make them fluffier." For the first time, Jamal looked up, meeting Martin's eyes. There was something searching in his gaze, something that seemed to be measuring not just Martin's words, but the truth behind them. That evening, after leaving the group home, Martin sat in his office long after his usual hours. His phone call to his legal team was brief and to the point. "I want to file for emergency guardianship. Yes, tonight. Use whatever resources necessary to expedite the process." The next few days moved at an unprecedented pace, even for someone of Martin's influence. Documents were filed, reviews were fast-tracked, and background checks were completed with remarkable efficiency. Money didn't solve everything, but it certainly helped grease the wheels of bureaucracy. A week later, Martin's car pulled up to the group home for the last time. Jamal stood on the steps, his backpack clutched tight against his chest, watching as Martin spoke with the staff and signed the final papers. The boy hadn't said much since that day they talked about eggs, but his silence felt different now. Less like a wall, and more like a pause between thoughts. The drive to Martin's estate took them out of the city, through increasingly green neighborhoods where houses grew larger and farther apart. Jamal pressed his face against the window, watching as apartment buildings gave way to manicured lawns and elegant gates. When they turned onto a private drive, the gate swung open silently, revealing a winding path bordered by old oak trees. The car's tires crunched softly on the gravel as they approached the house, though house seemed too modest a word for the limestone mansion that emerged from behind the trees. Martin glanced at Jamal in the rearview mirror. The boy's expression was hard to read as he took in the 3-story building with its large windows and careful landscaping. His hands hadn't loosened their grip on his backpack, which contained everything he'd wanted to bring from his old life, mainly his mother's bracelet, photos, and journal. The car came to a stop in front of wide stone steps leading to heavy wooden doors. Martin stepped out first, then opened Jamal's door with careful movements, trying not to startle him. "Welcome home," Martin said softly, gesturing toward the entrance. Jamal remained in his seat, still clutching his backpack, his eyes moving from the imposing doors to the manicured gardens to the fountain bubbling peacefully in the circular drive. He didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there as if waiting for something to make sense. The morning sun filtered through heavy curtains, casting unfamiliar shadows across Jamal's new bedroom. His eyes opened slowly, taking in the vast space around him, a room bigger than their entire old apartment. The king-sized bed felt like an ocean, and he had spent most of the night clinging to one corner of it, afraid of getting lost in its expanse. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 6:45 a.m. in soft blue numbers. At home, his old home, he would have been helping his mother get ready for work by now. The thought sent a sharp pain through his chest. Jamal slid out of bed, his bare feet meeting cold marble floors that made him shiver. The house was eerily quiet, nothing like the constant hum of city life he was used to. No sirens, no neighbors arguing, no music floating through thin walls, just silence. He padded across the room, his footsteps echoing slightly despite his attempt to move quietly. The hallway outside was long and lined with artwork that probably cost more than everything his mother had ever owned. The thought made his stomach twist. Following the faint sound of rustling paper, Jamal made his way downstairs. He found Martin in a sunroom that seemed to be made entirely of windows, sitting in a leather armchair with a newspaper spread across his lap. Morning light streamed in, making the room feel warmer than the rest of the house. "Good morning, Jamal," Martin said, looking up from his paper with a small smile. "Did you sleep well?" Before Jamal could respond, a movement caught his eye. A woman in a gray uniform, the maid, he realized, was dusting nearby shelves. When she noticed him, her hands faltered, and her eyes widened slightly before she quickly turned away, busying herself with straightening already perfect items on a side table. Jamal felt his shoulders tense. He recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen countless times before, in stores, on buses, in restaurants. The look that said he didn't belong. "There's breakfast in the kitchen," Martin continued, either not noticing or choosing to ignore the maid's reaction. "Mrs. Chen makes excellent pancakes. We should leave for school in about an hour." The kitchen was as impressive as the rest of the house, all gleaming stainless steel and marble countertops. Mrs. Chen, the cook, at least didn't seem bothered by his presence, simply sliding a plate of pancakes across the island toward him with a kind nod. An hour later, Martin's car pulled up to Riverside Academy. The building looked more like a small college than a school, with its brick facades and ivy-covered walls. Students in pressed uniforms streamed through the gates, carrying expensive backpacks and chatting about summer homes and private tennis lessons. Martin led Jamal through polished hallways to the administrative office, where a secretary with perfectly coiffed hair handed over his schedule and uniform. "Welcome to Riverside," she said with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The first class was English literature. Jamal arrived just as the teacher was introducing herself to the class. She paused mid-sentence when he entered, her brow furrowing slightly. "Ah, you must be the late transfer," she said, consulting a paper on her desk. "From the youth behavior program?" The class fell silent. Jamal felt heat rise in his cheeks as 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at him. "No," he said quietly. "I'm Jamal Carter. I'm supposed to be in this class." "Oh," the teacher's face flushed. "Of course, my mistake. Please take a seat." Jamal found an empty desk near the back of the room. As he sat down, he heard whispers rippling through the classroom. A boy 2 seats over leaned toward him with what seemed like genuine curiosity. "Are you the gardener's son?" the boy asked in a stage whisper. "My dad says Mr. Grayson hired a new landscaping company." Jamal's fingers dug into the edge of his desk. He stared straight ahead, not responding, trying to focus on the teacher's words about Shakespeare even as more whispers floated around him. The rest of the day passed in a blur of similar moments. Surprised looks from teachers, whispered questions from students, and the constant feeling of being watched. By the time Martin picked him up, Jamal felt like his skin was too tight, like he couldn't quite catch his breath. "How was your first day?" Martin asked as they drove home. "Fine," Jamal replied, staring out the window. Would you like to talk about it? No. Martin glanced at him in the rearview mirror but didn't push further. The rest of the drive passed in silence. That evening, after picking at his dinner and excusing himself early, Jamal lay in bed trying to make sense of his new reality. The house was quiet again, but through his open door he could hear Martin's voice drifting up from his study below. "It's going to take time," Martin was saying, his voice tired. "I'm doing the best I can with the boy." Jamal rolled onto his side, pulling the expensive duvet up to his chin. The words echoed in his head. With the boy. Not for the boy, or even just with Jamal. Just the boy. Like he was a project or a problem to be solved. Sleep refused to come. After an hour of staring at the shadowy ceiling, Jamal got up. His unpacked bags sat in the corner where he'd left them the day before. Moving quietly, he began to take out his few possessions. Some clothes, his mother's journal, a few photos, and finally, wrapped carefully in one of his old t-shirts, his mother's bracelet. The silver was slightly tarnished and one of the links was loose, but it was still beautiful. His mother had worn it every day, a gift from her own mother. She used to say it reminded her that she came from strong women, that she belonged to a line of survivors. Jamal carried the bracelet to his new desk, a massive thing made of dark wood that matched the rest of the room's expensive furniture. Opening the top drawer, he gently placed the bracelet inside. It looked out of place among the fresh notebooks and perfectly sharpened pencils Martin had provided, but maybe that was fitting. He was out of place too. The bracelet caught the moonlight streaming through the window, the silver gleaming softly in the darkness. Jamal stared at it for a long moment, his fingers lingering on the drawer handle. Everything else in this room, in this house, belonged to someone else's life. But the bracelet was his connection to who he really was, to where he came from, to her. Jamal sat in the back row of his history class, his posture rigid as he listened to Mr. Peterson lecture about the Civil War. The teacher's voice carried through the room with practiced authority as he wrote "States' Rights" in large letters across the whiteboard. The Civil War was a complex conflict, Mr. Peterson explained, driven primarily by economic differences and states' rights issues between the North and South. Jamal's hand shot up before he could stop himself. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. She'd always encouraged him to speak up when something wasn't right. Mr. Peterson paused, his marker hovering over the board. A look of mild surprise crossed his face as he noticed Jamal's raised hand. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" The classroom fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at him, but Jamal kept his gaze fixed on the teacher. "That's not accurate, sir. The Civil War was primarily about slavery. The Confederate States themselves said so in their declarations of secession. They wanted to preserve slavery and white supremacy." The silence deepened. Someone coughed awkwardly. Mr. Peterson's smile tightened at the corners. "Well, Jamal, while slavery was certainly one factor, it's important to understand the broader economic and political context." The teacher's voice took on a patronizing tone that made Jamal's stomach clench. "But the primary source document," Jamal started. "That's enough," Mr. Peterson cut him off firmly. "We need to move on with today's lesson." The class resumed, but Jamal could feel the sideways glances from his classmates. When the bell rang, Mr. Peterson called him aside. "Jamal," the teacher said, leaning against his desk with what he probably thought was a fatherly expression. "You're new here, so let me give you some advice. It's important to pick your battles. Not every discussion needs to become controversial." Jamal stared at the floor, his mother's bracelet feeling heavy in his pocket where he'd taken to carrying it. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, even as anger burned in his chest. In literature class that afternoon, Mrs. Harrison was handing back their essays on "To Kill a Mockingbird." When she reached Jamal's desk, she placed his paper face down and gave him a stern look. "See me after class," she said quietly before moving on. Jamal turned the paper over. Across the top in red ink was written, "See me regarding concerns about originality." His stomach dropped. When the other students filed out, Mrs. Harrison closed the classroom door. "Jamal, I need to discuss your essay with you. Your analysis of police violence and systemic racism in relation to Tom Robinson's case is, well, it's far too sophisticated for a student your age. I wrote it myself, Jamal said, his voice tight. Every word. Mrs. Harrison sighed. The vocabulary, the complex analysis, the citations of contemporary parallels, it's simply too mature to be believable. Did someone help you write this? No, Jamal insisted, his hands clenching into fists under the desk. I read a lot. I understand these things because I've lived them. My mother. He stopped abruptly, his throat closing up. I'll have to report this to the Academic Integrity Committee, Mrs. Harrison said, her voice gentle but firm. We take plagiarism very seriously at Riverside. That evening, Martin sat in his home office reading through the incident reports from both teachers. Jamal watched from the doorway as Martin's expression grew increasingly troubled. Finally, Martin looked up and noticed him. Come in, Jamal, he said, gesturing to a chair. We should talk about what happened today. Jamal entered but remained standing. There's nothing to talk about. They think I'm either too aggressive or too stupid to write my own papers. Martin winced slightly. I'm sure that's not... He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. I'll schedule a meeting with Principal Warner tomorrow. We'll sort this out. The meeting took place during first period the next day. Jamal sat outside the principal's office, able to hear fragments of conversation through the heavy door. Miscommunication, adjustment period, sensitivity training for staff. Principal Warner's voice was smooth, practiced. These incidents are concerning. Martin's voice was firm but measured. Jamal is an exceptional student. Of course, Mr. Grayson, we value diversity of thought at Riverside. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. When Martin emerged, his expression was carefully neutral. Principal Warner followed, her smile bright and professional. We're so glad to have Jamal with us, she said warmly. I'm sure once he adjusts to our academic standards, everything will run smoothly. Later that week, a glossy newsletter arrived in the mail. Jamal picked it up from the kitchen counter where Martin had left it. On the front page was a photo of Martin shaking hands with Principal Warner, both smiling broadly. The headline read, Grayson helps advance educational equity. Generous donation to support diversity initiatives. Jamal read the article quickly, his jaw tightening with each word. Martin had donated a substantial sum to the school's foundation, earmarked for promoting inclusive excellence and fostering diverse perspectives. Without a word, Jamal walked to the kitchen trash can and dropped the newsletter inside. The sound of the lid closing echoed in the empty kitchen, as hollow as the promises printed on those glossy pages. The Friday evening sun cast long shadows through the mansion's tall windows as Martin's guests began arriving for dinner. The sound of expensive cars crunching up the gravel driveway echoed through the house. Jamal stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his light blue button-down shirt for the third time. A knock came at his door. Jamal? Martin's voice was gentle but carried an undercurrent of tension. Would you mind coming down, just to say hello to everyone? Jamal smoothed his shirt one final time. Coming, he said quietly. The dining room gleamed with crystal and silver, illuminated by a massive chandelier that threw sparkles across the dark wood table. 8 adults in expensive clothing stood around holding wine glasses, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. They fell quiet as Jamal entered behind Martin. Everyone, this is Jamal, Martin announced, his hand hovering near but not quite touching Jamal's shoulder. Jamal, these are some old friends from college and a few business associates. A chorus of hellos filled the room. Jamal nodded politely, already counting the minutes until he could leave. Martin guided him to a chair at the far end of the table, away from the main cluster of guests. The first course arrived, some kind of fancy soup Jamal didn't recognize. He focused on his spoon, trying to ignore the glances being cast his way. The conversation flowed around him, full of inside jokes and references to places he'd never been. So, Jamal, a woman in a silk blouse leaned toward him, her voice carrying that special tone adults used when they thought they were being extra nice to children. How do you like your new school? It's fine. Jamal replied quietly, keeping his eyes on his soup. "Oh my," the woman exclaimed, turning to her companion. "He's so articulate." Jamal's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He could feel Martin shifting uncomfortably at the other end of the table. Another guest, a man with perfectly styled gray hair, jumped in. "Do you play basketball, young man?" "The school team is quite good, I hear." "No," Jamal said flatly. "I prefer debate club." This drew more impressed sounds from the guests, though Jamal noticed they seemed slightly thrown off script. The conversation drifted back to adult topics: stock markets, property values, someone's vacation home in the Hamptons. Jamal had almost made it through the main course when a man in an expensive suit, who'd had perhaps one too many glasses of wine, spoke up with a smirk. "Say, Martin, you're not trying to raise a woke Malcolm X, are you?" The table erupted in laughter. Crystal glasses clinked as people reached for more wine. Someone made a comment about liberal guilt gone too far. Jamal set his fork down carefully, the metal making a soft click against fine china. The sound was almost lost in the continuing laughter, but Martin heard it. Their eyes met across the table, Jamal's hard and cold, Martin's apologetic and uncertain. Without a word, Jamal pushed his chair back and stood. The laughter died awkwardly as he walked out of the dining room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Behind him, he could hear Martin making excuses. He's still adjusting. Sensitive topic. Long day at school. Jamal closed his bedroom door and sat on the edge of his bed, his hands gripping the expensive duvet cover. His mother's bracelet felt heavy in his pocket. He could still hear the muffled sounds of the dinner party continuing below. An hour later, after the guests had left, Martin knocked on his door. Jamal didn't answer, but Martin came in anyway. "Jamal, I'm sorry about what happened down there," Martin said, hovering in the doorway. "They didn't mean it like that. Sometimes people say thoughtless things when they've had a few drinks." Jamal continued staring straight ahead at his wall, where he'd hung no pictures and placed no decorations. The blank surface reflected how he felt, present but empty. "Would you like to talk about it?" Martin asked after a long silence. Jamal didn't respond. Eventually, Martin sighed and closed the door, his footsteps fading down the hallway. When the house had grown completely quiet, Jamal moved to his desk and opened his laptop. The screen's blue light illuminated his face as he typed "white savior" into the search bar. Articles and definitions filled his screen. He read about white savior complex, about how good intentions could mask deeper problems, about the difference between helping and saving. His cursor hovered over his email inbox. Dozens of unread messages from his old social worker sat there, each one asking how he was adjusting, if he needed anything, if he wanted to talk, each one promising that she was still there for him, still checking in, still making sure he was okay. Jamal selected all the emails. His finger rested on the delete key for a long moment. Then he pressed down, watching as the messages disappeared one by one. The empty inbox stared back at him, as blank as his bedroom walls. He felt something shift inside him, a final letting go. No one was coming to rescue him from this gilded cage. Not his old social worker, who probably had 100 other cases by now. Not Martin, who thought money could fix everything. And not himself. At least not the version of himself he used to be. The one who still believed in justice and speaking up and making things right. Jamal closed the laptop, plunging his room into darkness. The sounds of the city drifted in through his window. Distant sirens, the hum of traffic, the occasional shout. The same sounds that had filled the night his mother died. The same sounds that followed him from his old life to this new one. But now they felt different, more final somehow, as if they were saying, "This is where you are now. This is all there is." The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the affluent neighborhood. Jamal stepped out of the mansion's front door, letting it close softly behind him. He wore a plain gray hoodie and jeans, comfortable clothes for a Saturday morning walk. The air felt crisp and clean, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers from the perfectly maintained gardens. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, taking in the massive houses with their pristine landscaping and luxury cars parked in circular driveways. Each property seemed to compete with the next for grandeur, but they all shared the same sterile perfection that made Jamal feel like he was walking through a magazine spread rather than a real neighborhood. 2 blocks from Martin's house, a white SUV with neighborhood security, emblazoned on its side, pulled up alongside him. The guard inside, a middle-aged man with close-cropped gray hair and mirrored sunglasses, rolled down his window. "Excuse me, young man," the guard called out, his tone professional but stern. "I need to know which house you belong to." Jamal stopped walking but said nothing. His fingers traced the outline of his mother's bracelet in his pocket as he stared straight ahead. The guard stepped out of his vehicle, hand resting casually on his belt. "Son, I'm going to need you to answer me. Which house do you belong to?" Still, Jamal remained silent. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained impassive. Other residents out for their morning walks began to slow down, watching the scene unfold with poorly concealed interest. "All right then," the guard said, pulling out his phone. "We'll handle this another way." He made a call, speaking in clipped tones while keeping his eyes fixed on Jamal. "Yes, I've got a young man here who won't identify himself. 2 blocks east of the Grayson estate. No, he won't speak." Minutes that felt like hours passed. Jamal could feel the weight of stares from passing neighbors. Some had stopped to watch openly, while others pretended to be occupied with their phones while stealing glances. His cheeks burned with humiliation, but he kept his expression neutral. The sound of expensive tires on pavement announced Martin's arrival. His black Mercedes pulled up smoothly, and he stepped out, looking harried and concerned in his weekend casual wear. "What's going on here?" Martin asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. The security guard's demeanor changed instantly. "Mr. Grayson, I apologize for disturbing you on a Saturday morning. We found this young man walking in the neighborhood and he wouldn't identify himself. Protocol requires—" "This is Jamal," Martin interrupted, his tone sharp. "He lives with me. He has every right to be here." "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Grayson," the guard said, straightening his posture. "I had no idea he was with you. We just have to be careful, you understand? There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area." Martin's jaw tightened. "I understand you're doing your job, but an apology to Jamal would be appropriate as well." The guard glanced at Jamal briefly before turning back to Martin. "Of course, sir. Again, I apologize for any inconvenience." He retreated to his vehicle without ever directly addressing Jamal. As the security SUV drove away, the remaining onlookers dispersed, leaving Martin and Jamal standing alone on the sidewalk. Martin's initial righteous anger seemed to deflate, replaced by something more complicated. "Let's go home," Martin said quietly. They walked to his car in silence. Once they were alone in the vehicle, Martin's expression changed. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening. "You should have told him you live here," he said, his voice strained. "This whole situation could have been avoided." Jamal turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time that morning. "That's the problem," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Martin opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. They drove the rest of the way in silence. 3 days later, trucks arrived at the estate. Workers in hard hats began installing tall metal fencing around the entire property. The fence was elegant but imposing, 6 feet of black metal bars topped with decorative spikes. Martin supervised the installation from his home office window, occasionally making calls to ensure everything was proceeding according to plan. "It's for your safety," Martin explained when Jamal came home from school to find the construction underway. "After what happened the other day, I realized we need better security measures." Jamal watched as section after section of fencing rose around the property. The workers moved efficiently, and by dusk, they had nearly completed the perimeter. The setting sun cast long shadows through the bars, creating prison-like stripes across the manicured lawn. As twilight settled over the estate, Jamal stepped outside. He found a fallen branch near one of the ornamental trees and picked it up. Starting at the front gate, he began walking the perimeter of the new fence, dragging the stick along the metal bars. The sound was rhythmic. Click, 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 like a slow heartbeat in metal. He walked steadily, maintaining the same pace as the stick struck each bar. Past the rose garden where the staff worked so hard to maintain perfect blooms. Past the tennis court that neither he nor Martin ever used. Past the garage that housed 4 luxury cars. Past the small grove of trees that tried to look natural, but was as carefully planned as everything else on the property. The clicking of the stick against the fence bars echoed in the growing darkness. Each impact sent a small vibration up through his arm, a constant reminder of the barrier between him and the outside world. The fence might have been beautiful in an architectural magazine, but to Jamal, it felt like the final confirmation of something he'd known since he arrived. This wasn't freedom, it was containment. He completed the circuit, returning to his starting point at the front gate. The full loop around the property had shown him what he already suspected. There was no way out. The fence enclosed everything, sealing off the estate like a museum display case. Perfect, pristine, and completely cut off from the real world. Jamal let the stick fall from his hand. It landed in the grass with a soft thud, barely audible over the quiet hum of the security system that had been integrated into the new fencing. Above him, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, their light reflecting off the sharp points that crowned the top of his new cage. The Sunday morning sun filtered through the estate's tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Martin stood in the kitchen, dressed casually but impeccably in pressed khakis and a light blue button-down shirt, watching as Jamal picked at his breakfast. "I was thinking," Martin said, his voice carefully casual, "maybe we could do something together today, something special." Jamal looked up from his barely touched plate of eggs and toast, waiting. "Family photos," Martin continued, a hint of enthusiasm creeping into his tone. "Professional ones. I know an excellent photographer who could come over this afternoon." Jamal's fork paused halfway to his mouth. His first instinct was to refuse, but he saw something in Martin's expression, a kind of hopeful uncertainty, that made him hesitate. "Okay," he said quietly, though his stomach tightened at the word. Martin's face brightened. He immediately pulled out his phone and started making calls. Within hours, the photographer arrived, a woman named Sarah with an expensive camera and lighting equipment. She moved through the house with practiced efficiency, setting up shots with the precision of someone used to capturing perfect moments for perfect families. "Let's start in the garden," Sarah suggested, gesturing toward the French doors. "The light is beautiful right now." They followed her outside to the grand stone steps that led down to the rose garden. The flowers were in full bloom, creating a backdrop of carefully cultivated beauty. Sarah positioned them with professional authority, Martin standing slightly behind Jamal, both facing the camera. "Wonderful," Sarah called out, adjusting her lens. "Now, Mr. Grayson, if you could just move a little closer." "Perfect." Jamal, chin up slightly. "Beautiful. Now smile." Jamal tried. He curved his lips upward, but the expression felt foreign on his face. Click, click, click. The camera captured every forced moment. They moved inside to the grand living room next. The massive stone fireplace loomed behind them, its mantel decorated with expensive art pieces that Jamal had never seen Martin look at twice. Sarah positioned them on the plush sofa, rearranging throw pillows and adjusting their poses until everything looked perfectly casual in the most calculated way possible. "These are going to be gorgeous," Sarah enthused, checking her camera screen. "Now let's try one under the chandelier in the foyer." As they walked to the next location, Jamal couldn't help but notice how staged everything felt. The house itself seemed like a movie set, beautiful but hollow. Each room they posed in was immaculate, showing no signs of actually being lived in. Even their clothing felt like costumes. Martin had suggested Jamal wear a sweater that still had its price tags on, bought specifically for this occasion. Under the crystal chandelier, Sarah directed them to stand close together. "Mr. Grayson, why don't you put your hand on Jamal's shoulder? That would make a lovely connection point." Martin reached out, placing his hand on Jamal's shoulder. The touch was gentle, but Jamal's body reacted instinctively. He flinched, his shoulders tensing, his body trying to pull away before he could stop himself. The camera clicked rapidly, capturing the moment in perfect clarity. If Sarah noticed the reaction, she didn't show it. She continued directing them through various poses, her professional smile never wavering. But Jamal saw Martin's face fall slightly, saw the way his hand withdrew more quickly than necessary. Later that evening, while Jamal was working on homework in his room, his phone buzzed with a notification. Martin had posted one of the photos on social media. In it, they stood in front of the fireplace, Martin's hand hovering near but not quite touching Jamal's shoulder. The caption read, "Family isn't always blood. Blessed, family, love." Jamal stared at the post as the likes and comments began rolling in. So inspiring. What a beautiful story. This is what real family looks like. The numbers kept climbing. The post was going viral. He set his phone face down on his desk and tried to focus on his history assignment, but the words blurred together. After an hour of failing to concentrate, he decided to head downstairs for some water. Passing Martin's study, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. The room was empty, but a warm desk lamp cast a gentle glow across the space. Something new caught his eye, a silver frame on one of the built-in bookshelves. Jamal stepped into the study. The frame held one of the photos from that afternoon, the chandelier shot. He picked it up, studying his own face in the image. While Martin smiled warmly at the camera, Jamal's expression was blank, his eyes distant. There was no joy there, no connection, nothing that suggested family or belonging. He looked more like a prop than a person, a symbol in Martin's carefully curated narrative of redemption. The longer he stared at the photo, the more he saw what it really captured. Not a family moment, but a performance. Martin, the successful businessman showing his charitable heart. Jamal, the rescued child serving as living proof of Martin's goodness. It was marketing, not memory-making. With careful deliberation, Jamal turned the frame face down on the shelf. The soft thud of silver against wood seemed to echo in the quiet room. He stood there for a moment, his hand still resting on the frame's edge, feeling the weight of everything unsaid between him and Martin. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. At the base of the stairs, he paused, one foot on the first step. Words formed in his throat, about the photos, about the post, about everything that felt wrong in this perfect house. But the words stayed trapped behind his teeth. Jamal climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured and quiet. Halfway up, he stopped again, turning slightly as if to look back toward the study. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Whatever he might have said dissolved into the silence of the house. When he reached the top of the stairs, the upstairs hallway stretched before him, dark and quiet. The thick carpet runner muffled his footsteps as he walked past closed doors and expensive artwork, past Martin's room where a light still shone under the door, past all the empty guest rooms that would never be used. The silence followed him like a shadow, wrapping around him like the pristine walls of his gilded cage. The afternoon sun streamed through the school's windows, casting geometric patterns across the empty hallway. Jamal walked back from the restroom, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. He'd asked for a hall pass during history class, needing a moment alone after another discussion about the complexities of the Civil War. The first siren caught him mid-stride. Its harsh wail pierced the quiet, bouncing off lockers and closed classroom doors. Lockdown drill, he thought, his heart rate picking up despite knowing it wasn't real. They'd had 2 already this semester. Mrs. Henderson, the chemistry teacher, stepped out of her classroom to secure the door. When she spotted Jamal, her eyes widened. In a split second, her face transformed from surprise to fear. Before Jamal could speak, she lunged toward the nearest fire alarm and yanked it down hard. A second siren joined the first, creating a deafening chorus. Classroom doors flew open as students began pouring into the hallway. Through the chaos, Jamal heard Mrs. Henderson's voice, shrill and panicked. "Intruder! There's an intruder!" "Wait!" Jamal called out, raising his hands. "I'm a student!" Heavy footsteps thundered behind him. Before he could turn, something solid slammed into his back, driving him face first into the floor. His cheek scraped against the cold tiles as a knee pressed into his spine. "Got him!" a deep voice shouted. Security. Jamal felt cold metal close around his wrists, handcuffs clicking into place, tight enough to bite into his skin. "My name is Jamal Carter," he gasped, struggling to breathe under the weight. "I'm a student here. I have ID in my pocket." "Stop resisting!" The pressure on his back increased. More footsteps approached, voices talking over each other. Students were being ushered away, but Jamal could still hear their whispers, could imagine their stares. "I'm not resisting," he managed to say, his voice strained. "Please check my ID. Please." Minutes passed. The sirens continued their relentless screech. Jamal's arms ached from being twisted behind his back, and he could feel bruises forming where the handcuffs dug into his wrists. Finally, different footsteps approached. Dress shoes, not security boots. "Oh my God," came the principal's voice. "That's Jamal Carter. He's one of our students. Release him immediately." The weight lifted from Jamal's back. The handcuffs were removed, leaving angry red marks behind. As he pushed himself to his feet, he saw the crowd that had gathered. Teachers, security guards, and behind them, students peering around corners with phones raised. The principal, Dr. Matthews, stepped forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Jamal, I am so sorry for this misunderstanding. Let's get you to the nurse's office to check those injuries." "Have you called my guardian?" Jamal asked, his voice hollow. Dr. Matthews hesitated. "We'll do that right now." In the nurse's office, Jamal sat silently while ice packs were pressed against his bruised arms. The nurse kept making small, sympathetic noises as she documented his injuries. When Martin arrived 30 minutes later, his face was a mask of barely contained rage. "What happened?" Martin demanded, his voice clipped and controlled. Dr. Matthews launched into an explanation about unfortunate misunderstandings and necessary security protocols. Martin listened, his jaw tightening with each word. But he didn't explode. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he became more formal, more distant, the way he acted during difficult business negotiations. "And what steps will be taken to ensure this never happens again?" Martin asked, his tone arctic. "We'll be implementing additional sensitivity training for all staff," Dr. Matthews assured him. "And we're drafting a formal apology to the entire school community." "Sensitivity training," Martin repeated flatly. "Well, that should certainly prevent my ward from being assaulted in your hallways again." The drive home was silent. Martin gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles white. Twice he opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Jamal stared out the window, watching the expensive houses of their neighborhood slide past. As they pulled into the driveway, Martin finally spoke. "Let me take you to dinner. Anywhere you want to go. We should talk about what happened." Jamal shook his head. "I just want to go to my room." "Jamal, please." The word came out barely above a whisper. Martin's shoulders slumped slightly. "All right, but if you need anything." Jamal was already out of the car, heading for the front door. He climbed the stairs to his room without looking back, closing the door softly behind him. His laptop sat open on his desk, displaying the debate club website. He'd been working on an argument about systemic inequality for next week's meeting. Now, he opened his documents folder and began deleting files. His research notes, his practice speeches, his carefully crafted rebuttals. Each click of the delete button felt like cutting away a piece of himself. Next came his school essays, the one about generational trauma that his English teacher had praised while watching him with wary eyes. The history paper analyzing the economic impacts of redlining that had earned him suspicious glances. The sociology assignment about police reform that the teacher had asked him to tone down. He deleted them all. When he finished, Jamal stood up from his desk and walked to the full-length mirror mounted on his closet door. His reflection stared back at him, shoulders slightly hunched, arms crossed protectively over his chest. The bruises were starting to darken, forming distinct bands where the handcuffs had been. In the corner of the mirror, partially hidden behind a debate team ribbon he'd won last semester, was a small photo. His mother smiled out from the worn paper, her eyes bright and determined. She wore the same expression she'd had when fighting with landlords, when arguing with social workers, when standing up to anyone who tried to make her feel small. Jamal reached out and carefully removed the debate ribbon, letting it fall to the floor. Now his mother's photo was fully visible, her gaze meeting his in the mirror. He stood there for a long time, looking between her face and his reflection, feeling the weight of everything she'd fought for, everything she'd lost, everything she'd tried to protect him from. The bruises on his arms throbbed dully. Outside his door, he could hear Martin's footsteps passing by, pausing briefly before continuing down the hall. The house settled into its evening quiet, but Jamal remained standing, his mother's eyes locked on his reflection, bearing witness to all the words he couldn't say. The mahogany doors of the school boardroom loomed before Martin, their polished surface reflecting his determined expression. He straightened his tie, a gesture that reminded him of countless business negotiations. But this wasn't about money or contracts. This was about Jamal. Inside, the board members sat around a long table, their faces a mix of practiced concern and barely concealed irritation. At the head of the table sat Richard Whitmore, the board chair, a man who'd played golf with Martin's father for 30 years. "Martin," Richard said, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced warmth that came with old money and older prejudices. "We understand your concerns about the recent incident." Martin remained standing, his hands resting on the back of an empty chair. "Incident?" His voice was quiet but sharp. "My ward was assaulted in your hallways, handcuffed and pinned to the floor because a teacher couldn't tell the difference between a student and an intruder." "Now, Martin," Richard leaned forward, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light. "Let's not be dramatic. Security protocols were followed." "Followed?" Martin's knuckles whitened on the chair. "Mrs. Henderson pulled a fire alarm because she saw a black student in the hallway during class. That's not protocol, that's prejudice." A murmur rippled through the board members. Richard's smile tightened at the corners. "This is precisely why your father always said certain changes needed to happen gradually. Too much disruption leads to confusion." The words hit Martin like a physical blow. He could hear his father's voice in them, the same measured tone used to justify decades of resistance to integration, to change, to anything that might upset the careful balance of power. "My father," Martin said slowly, "is not relevant to this discussion." "Isn't he?" Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "The Grayson name carries weight in this community because of the standards he maintained, the traditions he protected." Martin straightened to his full height, letting his hands fall away from the chair. "Then let me make this simple. Either there are consequences for what happened to Jamal, or the Grayson Foundation will withdraw its support for the new STEM wing." The room fell silent. The board members exchanged glances, calculations running behind their eyes. The expansion project was worth millions, Martin's millions. Richard cleared his throat. "That seems extreme. Perhaps we could find a middle ground?" "What's your proposal?" Martin's voice was ice. After 30 minutes of careful negotiation, a compromise was reached. Mrs. Henderson would be placed on administrative leave, though the official reason would be personal matters. There would be no public statement about the incident, no admission of wrongdoing. The school would implement new security training, but any mention of racial bias would be carefully avoided. Martin left the meeting feeling hollow. He'd won, technically, but the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. Back at the estate, he found Jamal in the library, reading a worn copy of James Baldwin essays. The boy looked up as Martin entered, his expression guarded. "I have good news," Martin said, trying to inject enthusiasm into his voice. "We got them to move on this. Mrs. Henderson is being placed on leave." Jamal closed his book slowly. Did they say they were wrong? The question hung in the air. Martin shifted his weight. "Not directly, no, but..." "So nothing changes," Jamal's voice was flat. "That's not true. There will be new training procedures and..." "Did they admit what really happened?" Jamal pressed. "Did they say it was wrong to assume I was dangerous just because of how I look?" Martin hesitated. "These things take time, Jamal. We have to work within the system to..." "The system..." Jamal stood up, tucking the Baldwin book under his arm. "Right. The system that killed my mom. The system that lets you buy your way out of admitting racism exists. That system? Jamal, wait. But Jamal was already walking away, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous house. Martin heard him climb the stairs, then the soft but definitive click of his bedroom door closing. Hours later, when the house had grown dark and quiet, Jamal sat cross-legged on the floor of his walk-in closet. The space felt smaller, safer somehow than the vast bedroom beyond. His backpack lay beside him, unopened since the day of the incident. He'd been avoiding it, avoiding everything that reminded him of school, of belonging nowhere. With careful movements, he unzipped the front pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. His mother had given it to him on his 8th birthday, a simple thing she'd found at a thrift store, but he'd treasured it. Inside, folded carefully, was a letter he'd been writing to her, piece by piece, since the day she died. The paper was soft from being handled so often, the creases worn thin. He smoothed it open in his lap, reading over his previous entries. Some were angry, some confused, some just lists of things he wished he could tell her about his day. His eyes moved to the last entry, written the night before the lockdown. Sometimes I think Martin wants to help, but he doesn't know how. He tries to fix everything with money, like that makes the hurt go away, like it changes how people see me. Jamal pulled a pen from his pocket and added a new line, his handwriting careful and deliberate. I don't think I'm supposed to be here, not just this house, this world. The words stared back at him from the page, stark and honest in a way he couldn't be with anyone else. In the darkness of the closet, surrounded by expensive clothes he never felt comfortable wearing, Jamal folded the letter and placed it back in the box. He held it against his chest for a moment, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers, remembering his mother's smile when she'd given it to him. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping across his bedroom windows. The light didn't reach into the closet where Jamal sat, small and alone, holding his mother's memory and his own truth in a box that felt both too heavy and too light. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the estate's manicured lawn as cars began arriving for the family gathering. Martin stood at the front door, greeting relatives he hadn't seen in years with practiced smiles and firm handshakes. Jamal watched from the second-floor window, noting how different Martin looked among his own kind. More rigid, more conscious of his posture. They've changed, Martin had told him that morning, adjusting Jamal's collar with nervous hands. They're not like my father. You'll see. Jamal had only nodded, but his stomach had been tight ever since. Now, as he made his way downstairs in the pressed khakis and blue Oxford shirt Martin had bought him, he could feel the weight of eyes following his movement. The great room buzzed with conversation and the clink of crystal glasses. Aunt Patricia, who'd flown in from Boston, wore pearls that caught the light as she gestured. Cousin William, a hedge fund manager from Connecticut, dominated one corner with talk of market trends. Uncle Robert, who looked eerily like Martin's late father, stood by the fireplace nursing a scotch. There he is. Patricia's voice cut through the chatter. The young man we've heard so much about. Jamal forced his features into what he hoped was a polite expression. Hello, ma'am. It's nice to meet you. Such good manners, she said, loud enough for others to hear. Martin's influence, no doubt. More relatives gathered around, creating a circle that made Jamal feel like an exhibit at a museum. He answered their questions with careful restraint, each response measured against years of learning what white people wanted to hear. How do you like the private school? William asked, swirling his drink. Bet it's quite a change. It's challenging, Jamal said simply. William laughed. You're probably smarter than all of us, especially with that free ride. Heat crept up Jamal's neck, but he kept his voice steady. I work hard. Course you do, Uncle Robert chimed in. And with Martin's connections? Bet you're set for life, huh? The implications hung heavy in the air. Charity case, lucky break, Martin's pet project. Jamal felt his chest tighten. Would you excuse me? He managed. I need to use the restroom. He walked away with measured steps, refusing to hurry despite the urge to run. The guest bathroom on the first floor was his destination, the one place he knew would be empty. The bathroom was all marble and gold fixtures, a testament to old money's love of ostentation. Jamal gripped the edge of the sink, breathing deeply. That's when he noticed the photograph. It hung on the wall like any other decoration, but its significance hit him like a physical blow. The image showed a younger version of Martin's father, impeccably dressed in a suit, shaking hands with Governor Wallace, the man who had famously declared segregation forever. Both men were smiling, proud of their stance against progress. Jamal stared at the photo, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't just decoration, it was heritage. It was hung like a trophy, a reminder of where the Graysons stood in history. When he finally emerged, the party had moved to the dining room. He took his seat beside Martin, who was deep in conversation about the family foundation's latest initiatives. Jamal pushed food around his plate, barely tasting anything. As the afternoon wore on, Aunt Patricia cornered Martin in the study. Jamal, passing by, heard their voices and paused just out of sight. "Your father would be rolling in his grave." Patricia's voice was sharp with disapproval. "Taking in that boy? And now you're handing him keys to the kingdom?" "Patricia," Martin started. "No, listen to me. Your father built this legacy carefully. He protected it. And you're just giving it away to prove what? That you're not like him? That you're one of the good ones?" Jamal didn't wait to hear Martin's response. He slipped away silently, making his way through the house until he found himself in the garage. The space was cool and dim, filled with the smell of motor oil and leather from Martin's collection of vintage cars. At the far end stood a large cabinet, its heavy padlock catching what little light filtered through the high windows. Jamal stood before it, studying its solid construction, wondering what secrets it held behind its metal doors. He didn't turn when he heard footsteps behind him. "What's in there?" Jamal asked, still facing the cabinet. Martin's pause was heavy with hesitation. "Old family records." "Records of what?" Another pause. "Business dealings, correspondence, things from before." Jamal knew what before meant. Before civil rights, before integration, before people like him were considered people at all. "Burn it," he said, the words coming out flat and hard. The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of the party inside. Through the walls, they could hear laughter, the comfortable sound of people who had never questioned their place in the world. The Monday morning sun filtered through Martin's office windows, casting long shadows across his desk. He was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed, his father's estate lawyer's name flashing on the screen. Martin's hand hesitated for a moment before answering. "Martin Grayson speaking." "It's time," the lawyer said without preamble. "The estate has cleared probate. We need to discuss the trust distribution." Martin's throat tightened. He'd been waiting for this call for months, ever since taking in Jamal. The Grayson Legacy Trust had been frozen in legal proceedings, a complex web of holdings and investments that represented generations of family wealth. "I'll be there in an hour," Martin said, already reaching for his suit jacket. The drive downtown felt longer than usual. Martin's Mercedes crawled through traffic as his mind raced with calculations. $200 million. That was the estimated value of the trust. It wasn't just money. It was influence, connections, the kind of power that opened doors and shaped futures. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower. Martin nodded to the receptionist, who knew him by sight, and was immediately ushered into the senior partner's corner office. The view of the city stretched out below, but Martin barely noticed it. Lawrence Whitman, his father's lawyer for 30 years, stood to greet him. The older man's handshake was firm, but there was something in his expression that made Martin uneasy. "Please sit," Lawrence gestured to the conference table where documents were spread out in neat stacks. "We have a lot to cover." Martin took his seat, noting the thickness of the files. "I thought everything was straightforward now that probate's cleared." "That's what we all assumed," Lawrence adjusted his reading glasses, "until this morning's final review." The lawyer pulled out a particular document, its edges yellowed with age. This was buried in the original trust documentation. It wasn't indexed in the main contents. "We believe that was intentional." Martin leaned forward as Lawrence pointed to a section of dense legal text. The words seemed to leap off the page. No person of non-Caucasian descent may receive or be affiliated with direct heirs in any matter of distribution. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Martin read the clause again, then a third time. This can't be legally binding. It's discriminatory. Under normal circumstances, you'd be right. Lawrence removed his glasses. But your father was clever. The trust was established in 1962 and grandfathered through several legal restructurings. He used very specific language that ties it to private property rights rather than civil regulations. Martin's jaw clenched. And this matters now because you've legally listed Jamal Carter as your dependent and named him as a beneficiary in your personal will. Lawrence's voice was carefully neutral. The clause has been triggered. The implications crashed over Martin like a wave. His father, even from the grave, was reaching out to control him, to enforce his beliefs about who deserved to inherit the Grayson name and fortune. The trustees met this morning, Lawrence continued. They're unanimous in their decision to enforce the clause. Who are the trustees? Martin demanded. Your father's old colleagues from the bank, Mr. Henderson, Mr. Phillips, and Mrs. Blackwood. Of course, the old guard. People who'd nodded approvingly at his father's segregationist speeches at country club dinners. What exactly are they demanding? Lawrence laid out another document. You have 30 days to either remove Jamal from your will and annul the guardianship, or forfeit the entire trust. $200 million plus all associated properties and holdings. Martin stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The city sprawled below, a maze of streets and buildings where somewhere, right now, Jamal was probably sitting in class, unaware that his future was being discussed in cold legal terms. This is wrong, Martin said, his voice tight. It's legal, Lawrence replied. That's what matters in this room. Martin turned back to face the lawyer. And if I refuse? If I keep Jamal and forfeit the trust? The money goes to a consortium of conservative think tanks and private schools, all white institutions naturally. Your father was thorough in his contingency planning. The irony wasn't lost on Martin. His father had ensured that even defiance would serve his ideology. I need time to think, Martin said. You have 30 days. Lawrence gathered the papers into a folder. Not a day more. The drive home felt surreal. Martin's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly as his mind raced through options. $200 million could fund countless charitable initiatives, could help thousands of kids like Jamal. But it would mean giving up Jamal himself, betraying the trust of a boy who'd already been betrayed by too many adults. The estate's gates opened automatically as Martin's car approached. The house loomed ahead, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. This house, like everything else he owned, had been bought with Grayson money. Money that came with strings, with expectations, with the weight of generations of carefully maintained privilege. Martin parked in the garage but didn't immediately get out. He sat there, engine off, staring at nothing. His father's voice echoed in his memory. A Grayson always protects the legacy first. When he finally entered the house, he found Jamal in the living room. The boy was sprawled on the couch, watching TV with the volume low. Some documentary about space exploration played across the screen, casting shifting patterns of light across Jamal's face. Martin stood in the doorway, words failing him. Jamal glanced up briefly but didn't speak, already used to Martin's occasional moments of awkward hovering. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things Martin couldn't say. On the screen, an astronaut floated in the void of space, tethered to their ship by a single line. Martin watched the image flicker across Jamal's features and felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing down like gravity. The crack in the foundation was spreading, and Martin had no idea how to stop it. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9, its deep chimes echoing through Martin's empty office. He sat behind his mahogany desk, tie loosened, jacket draped over the back of his chair. The day's revelations weighed on him like physical pressure, making even the simple act of breathing feel labored. Through the ceiling, he could hear the faint sound of music from Jamal's room. The boy had developed a habit of watching old performance videos before bed, particularly those featuring his mother's favorite singer. Martin had noticed how Jamal's eyes would soften when certain songs played, as if he was remembering private moments with Renee. Martin's fingers traced the edge of his laptop, where spreadsheets displayed the full scope of the Grayson Legacy Trust. $200 million. The number seemed almost abstract, until he started breaking it down into real-world impact. Educational programs that could be funded, community centers that could be built, lives that could be changed. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Lawrence Whitman's name appeared on the screen. Martin's jaw tightened, but he answered, putting the call on speaker. "Martin," Lawrence's voice filled the room, "I just finished a conference call with the Board of Trustees." "And?" Martin's voice was flat, already anticipating the answer. "They won't bend." Lawrence's words carried the weight of finality. "The terms are absolute. If Jamal remains in your will or listed as a dependent, the entire trust is forfeited. 30 days to comply." Martin ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing through possibilities. What if I moved him to a private foundation? Set up a separate trust structure that... "They've thought of everything," Lawrence cut in, his voice tired. "I spent 2 hours proposing alternatives. They want him gone, Martin. Not repositioned." The brutal simplicity of it hung in the air. Not repositioned. Gone. "These are my father's old friends," Martin said quietly. "People who came to my graduation, who sent birthday cards." "People who shared your father's values," Lawrence corrected, "and who intend to honor them." Martin's gaze drifted to his father's photo on the shelf. Richard Grayson stood proudly on a golf course, one arm around a business partner, both men grinning. Behind them, partially obscured by gleaming golf trophies, a Confederate flag hung from the country club's pole. Martin had never noticed it before, or perhaps he'd trained himself not to see it. "Is there anything else?" Martin asked, his voice hollow. "No," Lawrence replied. "But Martin, don't take too long deciding. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes for everyone." Martin ended the call without responding. The office fell silent again, except for the distant sound of Jamal's music and occasional laughter floating down from upstairs. The boy was probably sprawled on his bed, headphones on, lost in memories of his mother through the songs she'd loved. The photo of Richard Grayson seemed to mock Martin from its perch. His father had always been strategic, always thinking 10 moves ahead. Even in death, he'd managed to force Martin's hand, to make him choose between his principles and his power to effect change. Martin stood, his chair rolling back against the wall. He walked to the shelf and picked up the photo, really looking at it for the first time in years. His father's smile didn't reach his eyes. It never had. It was the smile of a man who knew he held all the cards, who enjoyed watching others realize how little power they actually had. The sound of Jamal's laughter drifted down again, clear and unguarded. It was a rare sound, one that had taken months to emerge from behind the boy's careful walls. Martin set the photo face down on the shelf. His feet carried him to the stairs almost without conscious thought. Each step felt heavier than the last as he climbed toward Jamal's room. The music grew louder, an old soul song that Renee must have played often, judging by how well Jamal knew the words. Martin reached Jamal's door and stood there, hand raised to knock. Through the wood, he could hear Jamal singing along softly, his voice carrying echoes of his mother's joy. The moment felt fragile, like a soap bubble that would burst at the slightest touch. His knuckles hovered an inch from the door. One knock would shatter this peace. One conversation would change everything. Martin's hand trembled slightly, then slowly lowered back to his side. Inside the room, Jamal laughed again at something on his screen, the sound pure and unburdened. For now, at least, he was just a boy enjoying his mother's favorite music, unaware that everything was about to change. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen's tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble countertops. Jamal sat at the breakfast table, spreading jam on his toast with careful precision. He'd developed little routines over the past months, the way he arranged his plate, how he folded his napkin, the exact amount of orange juice he poured into his glass. These habits felt like small anchors in a world that still didn't quite feel real. Martin watched him from across the table, his own breakfast untouched. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten during the 20 minutes he'd spent rehearsing this conversation in his head. The morning paper lay folded beside him, its headlines unread. "There's something we need to talk about," Martin said finally, his voice measured and calm. Jamal's hand stilled, the knife hovering above his toast. He'd heard that tone before, from social workers, from teachers, from everyone who'd ever delivered bad news wrapped in careful words. His shoulders tensed automatically, preparing for whatever was coming. Martin cleared his throat, adjusting his tie even though it was perfectly straight. "There's a clause in the estate that's recently come to light. It's complicated." Jamal set down his knife, his appetite vanishing. The morning light suddenly felt too bright, too exposing. He waited, silent, as Martin searched for words. "I've been working with the lawyers," Martin continued, his businessman's composure slipping into place like armor. "I've found a workaround. If we quietly shift your guardianship status to a private custodian trust, not adoption, I can protect your future and secure the estate." The words hung in the air between them, each one precise and carefully chosen. Martin's hands were clasped on the table, his knuckles white with tension. He'd prepared this speech, Jamal realized, probably practiced it in front of a mirror. Jamal sat very still, processing. The legal terms tried to slide past him, but he caught their meaning. His mother had taught him to read between lines, to hear what wasn't being said. "So, I stop being your son so you can stay rich?" Martin's composure cracked slightly. He leaned forward, his voice taking on an urgent edge. "It's legal language, not real distance. Nothing would actually change. We'd still live together, still be family. It's just paperwork." "To you, maybe," Jamal said quietly. The words came out flat, empty of anger or surprise. Just tired recognition of something he should have known all along. Martin reached across the table but stopped short of touching Jamal's hand. "Listen, I know how this sounds, but the trust could do so much good. We could help so many people, and you'd still be taken care of, I promise." Jamal looked at Martin's outstretched hand, then at the expensive watch on his wrist. He thought about the security fence, the donation to his school, all the times money had been thrown at problems instead of facing them. "Like you took care of the school or the neighborhood guard?" "That's different," Martin protested, but his voice wavered. "This is about securing resources we can use to make real change." "No," Jamal said, pushing back from the table. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound harsh in the pristine kitchen. "This is about you choosing. Jamal, please." Martin stood too, his carefully constructed plan crumbling. "Let me explain the full situation. There are factors you don't understand." "I understand fine," Jamal said. He looked around the kitchen, at the imported tiles, the designer appliances, the fresh flowers in their crystal vase. All of it suddenly felt like props on a stage, arranged to tell a story that was never quite true. "You want to keep your money and your conscience, can't have both." "That's not fair," Martin said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Jamal walked to the sink and placed his dishes in it, each movement deliberate and controlled. The morning sun caught his mother's bracelet on his wrist, making the worn metal shine. "My mom used to say that fair is what people call things when they want to feel better about choices they already made." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Martin standing by the table, his breakfast growing cold, and his explanations dying unspoken. The day passed in a blur of avoided conversations and careful distance. Martin buried himself in work calls, speaking in hushed tones behind his office door. Jamal stayed in his room, silent and still. As evening fell, Martin finally emerged from his office, exhausted from hours of legal consultations. The house felt unusually quiet. No music drifted down from upstairs, no sound of Jamal's footsteps in the hallway. Something cold settled in Martin's stomach as he climbed the stairs. He knocked on Jamal's door. No answer. He knocked again, then pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was made untouched since morning. Jamal's phone lay on the nightstand, deliberately placed beside his school ID and house key. The closet door stood open, showing gaps in the carefully organized rows of clothes. Martin rushed downstairs to his study, pulling up the security system on his computer. With trembling fingers, he accessed the gate log. There it was. The front gate had been opened an hour earlier. The camera footage showed a small figure slipping through, backpack over one shoulder, walking purposefully into the gathering dusk. Jamal was gone. Martin stood in the empty house, surrounded by wealth built on generations of carefully worded clauses and strategic decisions. In the kitchen, Jamal's breakfast dishes still sat in the sink, the last trace of their final morning together. The evening sun cast long shadows across the marble floors, and somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed, its cry echoing unanswered through the expensive neighborhood. The midnight air hung heavy with late summer humidity as Jamal walked through streets he barely recognized. Where familiar brick buildings once stood, sleek glass and steel structures now reached toward the sky. The corner store where his mother used to buy him penny candy had transformed into a wine bar, its warm lighting spilling onto newly laid cobblestones. Even the streetlights seemed different, brighter, colder, more efficient. But there, like a stubborn memory refusing to fade, stood Miss Darlene's house. The small two-story home with its weathered green shutters and creaky front porch remained unchanged, a defiant holdout against the wave of urban renewal that had swept through the neighborhood. The porch light was on, as it always had been, a beacon in the darkness. Jamal's feet felt heavy as he climbed the worn wooden steps. The third one still creaked, just like it had when he was little. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it to knock, but before his knuckles could touch the door, it swung open. Miss Darlene stood there in her flower-print house dress, her gray hair wrapped in a silk scarf. Her eyes, sharp as ever behind wire-rimmed glasses, took in every detail of him. The expensive clothes that didn't quite fit right anymore, the backpack slung over his shoulder, the exhaustion written across his face. "Lord, child," she said softly, stepping aside. "Come on in before you catch your death out there." The house smelled exactly as Jamal remembered, like vanilla extract and fresh bread, with undertones of the lavender sachets Miss Darlene kept in every drawer. The living room was small but warm, filled with photographs and memories. He recognized himself in some of them, younger and smiling, standing next to his mother at church picnics and neighborhood gatherings. "Sit," Miss Darlene commanded, already heading toward the kitchen. "You look like you haven't eaten since breakfast." Jamal sank into the familiar floral print couch, his body suddenly aware of how far he'd walked. The springs squeaked beneath him, a sound that carried him back to afternoons spent here while his mother worked extra shifts. Miss Darlene returned with a plate of cornbread and beans, still warm from the stovetop. "Eat," she said, settling into her worn armchair across from him. "Then we'll talk." The food tasted like home, not the sterile perfection of Martin's kitchen, but real home, where flavors carried history and love. Jamal hadn't realized how hungry he was until the first bite touched his tongue. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful while Miss Darlene watched him with knowing eyes. When the plate was empty, she took it from him and returned with 2 cups of sweet tea. "Now," she said, sitting back down, "tell me what that man did." Jamal's throat tightened. "How did you know?" "Baby, I've known Martin Grayson longer than you've been alive." She took a sip of her tea. "And I knew it wasn't gonna end well the minute I saw him taking you to that house." "You knew him?" Jamal leaned forward, something clicking into place. "Did you know his family?" Miss Darlene's face darkened slightly. "Knew of them? Knew what they were about?" She paused, studying Jamal's face. "Your mama knew them better than most, though." The world seemed to tilt slightly. "What do you mean?" "Your mother cleaned that house every week for almost 2 years," Miss Darlene said quietly. "Back when old man Grayson was still alive. She never told you because she didn't want you carrying that weight." Jamal's hands began to shake. He set down his tea before he could spill it. "She worked there?" Till one day she came running here in tears." Miss Darlene's voice grew hard. "She'd caught the old man beating one of the other maids, something about a broken vase. Your mama tried to stop it, and he turned on her too. She quit right there, wouldn't even go back for her last check." The room seemed to spin. Jamal could picture his mother in that house, walking those same halls he'd lived in for months, cleaning those same marble floors, running from that same legacy that now threatened to erase him. "Martin," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He must have known. All this time." "Course he knew," Miss Darlene confirmed. "That boy was there that day, watched the whole thing from the stairs, didn't say a word. He was about your age then." Something cold and heavy settled in Jamal's stomach. All those careful smiles, those practiced words about family and belonging, they weren't about him at all. They were about Martin's guilt, his need to prove he wasn't his father. "I was never a son," Jamal said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "I was a receipt, something to pay off his conscience." Miss Darlene reached across and took his hand. Her palm was warm and calloused, real in a way nothing in Martin's world had ever been. "You listen to me, Jamal Carter. You ain't nobody's redemption project. You're your mama's son, and that's all you ever need to be." Tears burned behind his eyes, but he held them back. "He has to choose now," he said, "between keeping me or keeping his father's money, and he couldn't even tell me the truth about why." "Some people," Miss Darlene said softly, "spend their whole lives running from their shadows, never realizing they're the ones casting them." Later, lying on the narrow cot in Miss Darlene's guest room, Jamal stared at a water stain on the ceiling. The brown mark spread like a map of all the places his life had gone wrong. In its uneven edges, he could almost see his mother, young and proud, walking up that long driveway to clean another family's mess. Now here he was, her son, having fled from those same walls that had once witnessed her humiliation. The night pressed in around him, heavy with revelations he didn't want but couldn't unknow. His mother had walked those halls before him, cleaned their floors, suffered their cruelty. And in the end, she had died unheard, just another statistic in a system that valued property over people. Now he lay here, another ghost from those halls, carrying a history he never knew was his to bear. The water stain blurred as his eyes finally filled with tears, but he didn't wipe them away. Let them fall. Let them mark this moment when everything made a terrible kind of sense. The morning sun cast long shadows across Martin's study as he paced, phone pressed to his ear. His normally composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the desperation underneath. Each call ended the same way. No one had seen Jamal. "He wasn't in first period," the school administrator reported, her voice carefully neutral. "Or any classes after that." Martin ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Check the security footage. He must have—" "Mr. Grayson, we already did. He never arrived on campus." The security company was equally unhelpful. Yes, the gates had opened at 11:42 p.m. No, the cameras hadn't captured which direction Jamal had gone. The staff remained tight-lipped, averting their eyes when Martin questioned them. They'd seen this before. Rich families, their private dramas, the silence expected of them. Martin's fingers trembled as he scrolled through his contacts. He'd already called Jamal's old social worker, the group home, even the debate team coach. Nothing. The boy had vanished like smoke. Finally, he came to Miss Darlene's number. He'd saved it years ago, back when he'd first started researching Jamal's background. His thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before pressing dial. She answered on the second ring. "Took you long enough to call, Mr. Grayson." The calmness in her voice made his heart skip. "Is he—" "He's safe," she cut him off. Her tone carried decades of judgment. "He don't want you yet." Martin gripped the edge of his desk. "I need to explain." "No, you need to listen." The steel in Miss Darlene's voice stopped him cold. "That boy's been through enough of your family's explanations." The line went dead, leaving Martin alone with the morning light and his failures. Hours later, Martin sat across from his lawyer in the sterile conference room. The city sprawled below them, a maze of streets and stories he'd never bothered to understand. Papers covered the polished table. Inheritance documents, trust agreements, generations of carefully protected wealth. "I have a proposal," Martin said, his voice steady despite his rumpled appearance. "We void the will. All of it. Not just my portion, the entire Grayson legacy. The lawyer, Gregory Wells, removed his glasses slowly. Martin, think about what you're saying. This isn't just about the money. You'll lose everything. The properties, the investments, your position on every board. Good. You've spent your whole life building on this foundation. Without the Grayson name, maybe it's time to build something clean. Martin leaned forward. Draw up the papers. Gregory shook his head. You'll never get another board seat. The business world has a long memory, and this kind of rejection, they won't understand it. They don't need to. The lawyer studied him for a long moment. Your father. My father is dead, Martin cut in, and I'm tired of living in his shadow. Back at the estate, the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple as Martin approached the garage. His footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as he moved toward the locked cabinet that had haunted Jamal's questions. The key felt heavy in his hand. Inside, decades of carefully organized evil waited in manila folders and leather-bound ledgers. Martin began pulling them out, his hands trembling as he read the labels. Prison labor contracts, 1985. Housing development restrictions, 1972. Campaign contributions, private, 1968 to 1990. Photos spilled from one folder. His father shaking hands with politicians, signing documents, always smiling, that confident smile of a man who knew the system worked for him. Behind each image lay a story of discrimination, of lives destroyed for profit, of power built on other people's pain. Martin carried the boxes to the fire pit on the back patio. The stone circle seemed too small to contain such a weight of history, but it would have to do. He began feeding documents to the flames, watching as years of carefully hidden cruelty turned to ash. Profit reports from privately owned prisons disappeared in orange sparks. Photographs curled and blackened. Ledgers full of bribes and backdoor deals crumbled into nothing. Martin worked methodically, making sure each page caught fire. Each record burned completely. The flames grew higher, casting dancing shadows across the patio. Martin didn't notice the figure beyond the fence at first, too focused on his task. But something made him look up, and there was Jamal, standing just beyond the metal bars. The boy's face was unreadable in the growing darkness, but his eyes reflected the firelight. He watched silently as Martin fed the last of his father's legacy to the flames. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that the fire wasn't already saying for them. Martin's hands were stained with ash, his expensive suit spotted with soot. He stood there, surrounded by the dying embers of his inheritance, while Jamal remained on the other side of the fence. The barrier between them seemed both physical and symbolic, a division built by generations before them, now slowly burning away in the gathering night. The flames consumed the final documents, and still, they maintained their silence. The only sound was the crackling of burning paper and the soft whisper of an evening breeze. In that moment, with the fire casting its judgment and Jamal bearing witness, Martin understood that some distances couldn't be crossed with words alone. Some debts required more than money to repay. Some wounds needed more than good intentions to heal. The last ember floated upward, a tiny star against the darkening sky, before disappearing into the night. Martin and Jamal remained where they were, separated by the fence, connected by the ashes of a burning legacy, waiting to see what would rise from the ruins of everything they'd thought they knew. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as reporters jostled for position, their cameras and microphones creating a forest of equipment. The morning sun glinted off the building's marble columns, casting long shadows across the crowd that had gathered for what many were calling the trial of the decade. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Civil rights activists sat shoulder to shoulder with members of old money families. Legal scholars scribbled notes, their pens scratching against paper. The air felt thick with tension as the bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Sarah Mackenzie." The case of Martin Grayson versus the Grayson Legacy Trust had begun. Martin sat at the plaintiff's table, his normally pristine appearance showing signs of strain. His tie was slightly crooked, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. His lawyer, a different one from his usual counsel, arranged papers with quiet efficiency. Across the aisle, the trustees' legal team projected confidence. They represented old money, old power, and old ways of thinking. Their suits were expensive, their expressions carefully neutral as they watched Martin approach the stand. "Please state your name for the record," the clerk intoned. "Martin Edward Grayson." "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." Martin's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. His testimony began with the trust document itself. Page by page, he exposed the carefully hidden clause that had triggered this whole ordeal. The words appeared on the courtroom's display screen, stark and unavoidable. "No person of non-Caucasian descent may receive or be affiliated with direct heirs in any matter of distribution." But Martin didn't stop there. His voice grew stronger as he continued, methodically unveiling decades of his family's carefully hidden crimes. He detailed how the Grayson fortune had been built on the backs of others' suffering. "In 1968, my father established contracts with 3 private prisons," Martin testified, his words cutting through the stillness. The inmates were predominantly Black and Hispanic. They worked for pennies an hour manufacturing furniture that my father's company sold at premium prices. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Martin continued, describing how the Grayson Real Estate Division had systematically engaged in redlining, pushing Black families out of developing neighborhoods. He explained the complex web of shell companies used to hide discriminatory housing practices, the political bribes that kept investigations at bay. Some of the older Grayson family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others glared at Martin with undisguised hatred. But he kept speaking, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was revealing. "I spent years pretending these were just old papers in a locked cabinet," Martin admitted. "I told myself I was different because I didn't actively participate. But silence is participation. Inheritance is participation." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Grayson, you understand that by testifying to these activities, you're exposing yourself and your family to potential legal consequences?" "Yes, Your Honor." Martin's gaze remained steady. "I don't want the inheritance if it means denying the only person who ever made me want to be a father." The trustees' legal team launched their counterattack immediately. They portrayed Martin as unstable, suggesting that his recent behavior indicated a mental break. They questioned his judgment, his loyalty, his understanding of his father's legacy. When they turned their attention to Jamal, their tactics grew even sharper. They painted a picture of an ungrateful, troubled youth who had manipulated his way into the Grayson household. They cited his school incidents, his running away, his volatile history in the foster system. "The trust exists to protect the Grayson legacy," their lead attorney argued. "This boy is clearly unfit to be part of its future." The room tensed when Jamal was called to testify. He walked to the stand slowly, wearing a suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. His expression was composed, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he was sworn in. The trustee's attorney tried to provoke him, asking pointed questions about his behavior, his gratitude, his understanding of proper society. Jamal answered each question calmly, his responses measured and clear. Finally, Judge Mackenzie held up her hand, silencing the attorney's latest attempt to rattle the young witness. She looked directly at Jamal, her expression softening slightly. "I have one question for you," she said. "Has Martin Grayson treated you like a son?" Jamal's gaze moved slowly across the courtroom. He looked at Martin first, seeing the man who had tried to save him, who had failed in some ways but never stopped trying. His eyes swept over the jury, 12 faces waiting for his answer. Then his attention caught on something in the public gallery, a phone screen displaying photos from the day his mother died. The images were small but clear: police tape, an ambulance, a body being covered. His mother's last moments reduced to viral content, shared and reshared without context or care. Jamal's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of every moment that had led him to this stand. "Martin was scared," he began. "Weak, privileged." He paused, his words filling the silent courtroom. "But he was also kind and human, and he never walked away. That's more than I can say for this trust, this court, and this country." His gaze remained steady, unflinching. I won't lie to burn it down, but I won't lie to protect it either." The silence that followed his words felt absolute. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a rustle of paper broke the stillness. In that moment, the weight of truth hung in the air like suspended dust, waiting to settle and reveal what remained beneath. 2 months after the trial, autumn leaves scattered across the city streets, marking the passage of time with their gentle descent. The legal world was still reeling from Judge Mackenzie's landmark decision to void the racist clause in the Grayson Legacy Trust. The ripples of that ruling had turned into waves, crashing against the shores of generational wealth across the country. Martin's office, once filled with expensive furniture and artwork, now held only a few boxes and a simple desk. He worked methodically, signing papers that would transfer millions to legal equity groups. His resignation letters from various boards of directors were stacked neatly in one corner, each one representing another tie cut from his father's world. The sale of the Grayson estate had made headlines, but not as many as the federal inquiry that followed. Investigators dug deep into the foundations of America's oldest fortunes, uncovering similar discriminatory clauses hidden in trust after trust. Law firms specializing in estate planning found themselves scrutinizing decades-old documents with new eyes, while their wealthy clients nervously awaited the results. Jamal watched it all unfold from a distance. His phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from major networks, offers of full scholarships from prestigious universities, and invitations to speak at civil rights events. He declined them all with a polite but firm, "No, thank you." Instead, he focused on his college application to Howard University, pouring his experiences into a personal statement that explored what he called paper racism, the way discrimination lived on in contracts, clauses, and legal documents long after its authors were gone. The modest apartment he now shared with Martin was nothing like the mansion they'd left behind. The rooms were small, the furniture simple, the views ordinary. But there was something honest about the space that the estate had never possessed. They weren't trying to be father and son anymore. That pretense had fallen away like old paint, revealing something different underneath. They were just two people who had chosen not to abandon each other after the storm. Their evenings often passed in silence, broken only by the clink of forks against plates or the soft whoosh of cars passing on the street below. But it wasn't the tense silence of the mansion, heavy with unspoken words and hidden truths. This silence felt more like a shared language, one they were both still learning to speak. Every Sunday, Jamal made his way to Miss Darlene's house. She always had coffee brewing and stories ready, not just about his mother, but about the neighborhood, the community, the history that textbooks forgot to mention. Her home remained unchanged while the world around it transformed, a steady anchor in shifting waters. One crisp morning, Jamal's feet carried him past the old Grayson estate. The mansion loomed behind newly installed security fencing, its windows dark and empty. The manicured lawns had begun to grow wild around the edges, nature slowly reclaiming what wealth had once controlled. A small crew of workers gathered near the front gate, their tools scattered around the base of a new installation. One man carefully wiped dust from a bronze plaque, while another adjusted its angle. The morning sun caught the metal, making the fresh lettering gleam. Jamal approached slowly, hands in his pockets. The workers glanced at him but didn't stop their task. They couldn't know who he was. To them, he was just another passerby, curious about the new historical marker being placed in front of this abandoned symbol of wealth. He stood there, reading the words that had been chosen to mark this chapter of history. The plaque was simple, but direct. This site represents both wealth and wrongdoing. Built by exploitation, inherited without question, and ultimately confronted by truth. History isn't what you inherit, it's what you break. The words hung in the air like a verdict, final and unchangeable. Jamal stood motionless, letting them sink in. The workers continued their tasks around him, the soft scrape of their tools providing a quiet soundtrack to the moment. After a long pause, Jamal turned and walked away. He didn't look back at the mansion, the plaque, or the workers. His footsteps were steady as he moved forward, leaving the physical reminder of the past behind him. The morning traffic continued its usual flow. The city moved around him, unchanged by this small moment of remembrance. But something had shifted, subtle as a change in air pressure before a storm. The truth was there now, cast in bronze, impossible to ignore or hide behind locked cabinet doors. Jamal walked on, his shadow stretching ahead of him in the morning light. The modest apartment he shared with Martin waited ahead, along with their quiet dinners and shared silences. Miss Darlene's house stood in another direction, holding its own histories and truths. And somewhere beyond all of that, Howard University represented a future he was choosing for himself, one word at a time. The historical marker behind him would stand as a testament to what had happened, but Jamal carried a different kind of marker within himself, not cast in bronze or carved in stone, but written in the choices he made each day, in the truths he refused to ignore, and in the silences he chose to break. If you enjoyed the story of Jamal, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.